I think now it is time to introduce our final speaker of the summit. And that is Navina Khanna, the Executive Director of the HEAL Food Alliance. And I first heard about HEAL at our 2017 summit when Ricardo Salvador, who had been involved in starting HEAL, said, this is a group you really ought to watch and look. And over the last just 4 years, they've made incredible headway establishing this powerful coalition of over 50 organizations around the country that are developing strategic campaigns for strong community-based food systems that address corporate control of our food system and build political leadership for food systems change. And as we reflect on the stories of resilience and innovation from our partners these past couple of weeks, I think we're incredibly fortunate to bring in a voice from across the country, from Oakland, California, to speak about the work of HEAL and the challenge, and to challenge us and motivate us to think about how we move forward on this day of renewal. So for over 20 years, Navina's been cultivating justice through food and farming systems, working as an educator, a community organizer, facilitator, and much more. And so with that, Navina, a big welcome to you, and thank you so much for joining us at this time.
Thanks so much for having me here with all of you. I'm honored to be here at the tail end and to help wrap up what sounds like it's been an incredible summit and to join a really strong community. Yeah, it's a gift to be here with you all. I can't have this conversation today without explicitly starting off by naming some recent events that have happened and bringing a few folks into this room with us. I want to first name Daunte Wright, who was killed in the same way that Oscar Grant was murdered by a police officer 10 years ago here in Oakland. And he was in his car, just like Philando Castile and Sandra Bland. And all of that has happened in the midst of a trial to convict George Floyd's murderer. George Floyd, who died just after Breonna Taylor. And those are just a tiny handful of the names of Black people who have been murdered by police officers in recent years. And I want to bring them into the room because we really can't have a conversation about food justice or food sovereignty or what it means to move forward together without having a conversation about them. So Daunte Wright, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, and too many others are some of the recent victims of state-sanctioned force that was literally designed to regulate Black bodies, right? The officers that killed them are part of a lineage that was first established in the 1700s to capture people who were running away from enslavement. So just to pause for a moment and talk about that through line, we know that folks were kidnapped from their homelands. They were forced to migrate in overcrowded ships across oceans to arrive at this land. And for what? To work in the fields, right? To grow cotton and sugar and more. Not just to feed an empire, but for the colonizers to accumulate enough wealth that they could claim other lands. Their labor was essential to the empire, but their bodies were considered so disposable that it literally wasn't worth it to the profiteers to make sure that they had good food, good housing, good health. They could just import other people. Those folks were locked in, and if they ever tried to run away, there was a state-sanctioned force to arrest them and put them in their place. We now know that force as a ubiquitous police force, right? It's armed with guns and connected to an elaborate, interwoven, for-profit system that's designed to literally lock up and put away anyone whose behavior or appearance doesn't uphold the status quo, right? And that status quo was designed for the accumulation of wealth by a select few off of the backs of others. right? It's a force, that police force was literally designed to protect property and protect profit. And that's the basis of our food system here in the US, right? The dehumanization, the commodification, the regulation of Black and brown bodies. And the last time that we know that we had thriving food systems on this land was when indigenous wisdom was the norm, right? Systems that were based in reciprocity and a reverence for the abundance and sovereignty of this beautiful planet that we live on. But instead of leaning into and learning from that wisdom, colonizers chose extraction, land theft, genocide, continued dehumanization. So the system that we're living in today, it wasn't designed for any life to thrive, and certainly not for Black and brown people to thrive. And I wanted to offer just a couple of examples of how this plays out today. And these are not going to be news to this group. You know, as well as I do, that the hyper-consolidated, globalized food system where power and decision-making is in the hands of just an elite few, that's completely at odds with our communities thriving, with our soil thriving, and more. Just over a year ago, when COVID-19 hit, the world as we know it was shook up, right? And as we were faced with calamity, as happens over time, when we're faced with calamity, we're forced as people and as communities and as countries to go beyond the realms of what we thought or were told was possible, right? People were starting to see the cracks in a system that was designed to uphold white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism. But within weeks of the declaration of a pandemic, the then president released an executive order allowing processing plants to stay open. So this executive order exempted plants from basic CDC guidelines, right? It said that there didn't need to be 6 feet of distancing. They didn't need to provide personal protective equipment. They didn't need to provide paid sick days or shut down plants if people got sick. The idea there was that it was fine to maintain business as usual, to protect profit off of the backs of a mostly Black and Latinx and Asian workforce. And what we learned shortly after is that the language in this executive order was written by those companies themselves. Companies like Tyson and Smithfield and JBS and others. And it's taken over a year since that pandemic first hit to actually get an emergency standard in place that will protect these workers from COVID. And the truth is that we know COVID is not the only thing that Black and brown workers are vulnerable to, right? There's been a long history of exclusion and a long history of being treated as disposable. Just like our police force is a legacy of slavery, it's also the fact that so many food and farm workers who are working jobs that were held by formerly enslaved people are exempt from fair labor laws. And what we see is that these corporations and this idea that profit is more valuable than people is still what we continue to put forward. Now, at the same time when COVID hit, all over the country, communities were finding ways to support each other, right? Through mutual aid and through community care. And so much of the genius and wisdom and brilliance that was growing up through the cracks was led by BIPOC communities, right? BIPOC communities throughout time, because of necessity, have always found ways to take care of each other outside of a system that wasn't designed for us. Folks were coming together to grow food, to prepare food, to get it out into community, to really meet each other's needs in neighborhoods and in communities all over the place. But instead of resourcing those communities and leaders with the materials that they needed, including many folks in the Northeast, sometimes it was things as simple as a refrigerated truck or a packing shed or having a kitchen. Philanthropy decided to do studies, right? To fund white-led organizations to extract even more, in this case, knowledge from BIPOC communities. No matter who we are or where we come from, we all want to know that our families and our communities can and will thrive now and into the future, no matter what conditions we're facing. But the truth is that this mentality that we're talking about, this mentality of extraction and exploitation, it doesn't just stop at the exploitation of Black and brown bodies, right? It's the same mentality that drives industrial agriculture, that drives air and water pollution, biodiversity loss, mass soil loss. It's the same mentality that is driving climate change, including the storms in the Gulf and the wildfires in California. We just got recent headlines that we're going to have some of the worst wildfires that we've ever seen this year in California, and we know that that's just going to keep happening. We know who is hit first and worst, but in the end, we all lose. So through this system, as you all know, we're literally exploiting ourselves to extinction. And right now, power and decision-making and control is all held in the hands of just a handful of corporations, right? Greedy CEOs and politicians whose pockets are being lined by them. They're making decisions that affect our whole lives, right? Whoever controls our land, our labor, our seeds, our food, that's who controls our lives. And right now, it's 3 that control the seeds, 4 that control the meat industry, 5 that control grocery stores. The truth is that life is sacred. And instead of letting these corporations control our lives, our survival depends on our ability to create a new story and new systems that actually value life, right? That value our lives. And it depends on our liberation from an extractive economy that dehumanizes us and devalues us, that devalues the rights of Mother Earth. And it depends, our survival depends on our ability to be able to see all of our struggles as one, right? Being part of a strategic and effective movement for change requires that we're able to see ourselves as part of an ecosystem together. And biologists say that the best way to heal a damaged ecosystem is to connect it to more of itself. So summits like this one that you all have been a part of, convergences that you all are doing together, the networks that you're building, I see our movement as an ecosystem, right? That the interconnections between us are the biodiversity that allows us and all life to thrive. And for too long, sustainable agriculture movements, food justice movements, and more have operated much like industrial agriculture, right? In silos. But it's time for us, it's high past time for us to be able to see these interconnections and come together. So in my job as a founder and the executive director of the Heal Food Alliance, I am so honored that I get to facilitate an unprecedented collaboration of farmers and ranchers and indigenous leaders and scientists and public health advocates and community organizers and folks from all over that are connecting and uniting across race and sector and geography, because they all know that they have a stake in a better future, right? Heal was co-founded by 4 organizations, including UCS that Peter just mentioned, who saw that their struggles were interlinked, right? We launched publicly just 4 years ago, born out of that knowledge that no single individual, no single organization, no one sector could transform these interwoven systems of colonialism and capitalism and white supremacy and heteropatriarchy alone or in isolation. We know that transformation requires the diverse skills and roles and resources of each of us, all of us working together to build our collective power for change. And I know that many of our members are here, that are part of the Farm to Institution Network. So I know that we'll continue to keep building together. And it's critical that we do that right now, because despite the fact that we are in such an urgent moment, the reality is that the world that we need and the change that we seek, it's actually not yet politically possible. And it's up to all of us to make it that way. And each of us has a critical role to play in stewarding that transition, right? I know that this morning you all went through a visioning exercise, and now at this time, it's our moment to reimagine and reinvent our world together, right? The urgency of this moment actually demands that we do this. So I want to invite you all, as we start to reach the close of your summit together, to just take a breath with me. And wherever you are, hopefully you can just ground your feet into the floor and just take a breath with me for a moment and feel into your own truth. And remember that vision exercise that you did together this morning. So you are one of hundreds of people. I think Sarah said it was about 600 people over the 3 weeks who chose to be a part of this convergence, right? Who chose to connect with other people. And that's part of our truth, right? That collaboration and coexistence and community, that's both what we really crave, and that's what we've seen this last year, and it's what we need. So as you imagine that vision of the future that you all talked about this morning, what is your role in stewarding this new food system? If you've ever wondered what you might have been doing during slavery, during the Civil War, during genocide, this is it. This is that moment. So this is where we make that choice of who we are and who we're going to be. Are we going to let those corporations, that fascism, that idea that somehow profit is more valuable than our lives be the thing that reigns, or are we going to choose something better? So this moment demands that we let a new life emerge, a new world thrive, that we let something more beautiful than we ever thought possible actually come into being together. And this moment calls on us to create that possibility of being truly nourished by community, not fed by competition, not driving capitalism. We know, and you all know, that we can't eat our way to change. We can't buy our way to change. We can't tweet our way to change, but we can organize, and it's going to take all of us. So I actually want to invite folks to drop into the chat one role that you will play in stewarding this new system. So I know folks have a lot of different roles that you play here, and I don't know all of you, you don't know all of me, or you all don't know me, but there are so many different kinds of things that people are already doing to make change. And I'd love to see just a few of the roles that you imagine yourself playing. It could be something that you're already doing now or something that you aspire towards. So I already know that Peter and Sarah and Tanya and others are committed to continuing to convene people together. What are some other roles that folks imagine themselves playing or will be playing to steward this new food system? I see a couple of things coming in. I see healing and educates. What else? Being a learner, facilitating a network of Black farmers, yes. Advocating for public institutions to adopt values-based procurement standards, growing more than we need and sharing it with others. Organizing with the Northeast Queer Farmers Alliance, supporting youth to be the change makers. Oh my gosh, these are so many good things. Making space and removing barriers for BIPOC growers, listening to more people. This is so good, keep them coming. Yes, washing the dishes after organizing a potluck. There is a role for everybody, and that is sometimes the most valuable role. Washing the dishes. So many dishes. Yes, these are beautiful. Continuing to push philanthropy to resource BIPOC producers, food justice advocates, food sovereignty activists, feeding friends and community members to grow engagement and passion in the food system. Connecting BIPOC women and veteran farmers to institutional market opportunities. Supporting white people working in the food system to understand and dismantle white supremacy. Thank you, Catherine. Championing urban farming. These are great. So I want to encourage you to keep dropping your roles in the chat and keep sharing with each other there. And just to take a few minutes to think back through history. And I know that you all are organizing this network together that's going to keep working on strong campaigns together. And just to think for a moment about what it takes to build strong campaigns. When we look at any movement through history, and there's a few key ones that we can highlight, right? So we can talk about the civil rights movement, the United Farm Workers movement, both of which happened around the same time. In both cases, there's a frontline group of folks who are most negatively impacted by the systems of oppression, right? In the case of UFW, farm workers, in the case of civil rights, Black folks who are struggling just to live, just to be. What we saw in both cases is that movements were able to be built, to thrive, and to win because they listened to the leadership of those frontline communities, right? Frontline folks, farm workers, for example, were able to say, here is what we need right now, and to articulate that. Black folks in the South were able to say, here's what we need right now, and then invite others to join them. And ordinary people who were not from those frontline communities found ways to use their skills, their resources, their relationships to support those frontline community groups. So, for example, if we look at what happened during the civil rights movement and the sit-ins at lunch counters. So Black folks went to sit at the lunch counters, and they had white allies who supported them in doing that, right? On the freedom rides, we saw Black folks, if they got on the bus by themselves, they were most certainly going to be attacked. But white folks decided to get on the bus with them. And when those white folks decided to get on the bus with them, their parents were suddenly afraid of what might happen for their children, right? So their parents started paying attention to that. And because these white parents started to care, some news outlets started to care about that. And it started making headlines, and it started going up the chain until there actually was a response from the federal government, right? But it took people organizing, knowing what their role was, and bringing in other allies, and allowing and ensuring that frontline communities were in leadership and were voicing exactly what it was that they really needed, and then folks figuring out how they could support them in that, right? And them inviting other folks in. The reality is that throughout history, whether it is the Latinx and Filipino farm workers who were organizing in the Central Valley with Black Panthers in Oakland, and then shipyard workers in London, or whether we're talking about Black and white and other folks that were organizing in the South, or when we're talking about what happened in Standing Rock over these last few years, where Indigenous folks took the front lines and people from all over came to support them, or we're talking about the movement for Black lives right now, where other groups are saying, you know, we are in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. All of that is based on the relationships that folks build with each other and the kind of trust that folks build with each other, right? Being part of a movement ecosystem requires that we build with each other in those ways, that we build with each other, listening to frontline leadership first, and build from that place where we can work together. So I want to just share a few of the protocols and principles that we hold as HEAL in our work together, right? We know that building a multiracial movement across sector, across geography, that is up against the scale of change that we are trying to make, that's no easy task, and that we are at an unprecedented moment right now. So I want to share a little bit of this just for some flavor. And as you're thinking about what it means for you to play a role in stewarding this new food system, I want to ask you who you are building with in order to do this. And so I see folks making more and more comments in the chat around the roles that you're going to play. I want to transition folks to also answering the question now of who are you building with, and who are you centering as you're building? And as you're adding to the chat and putting in who you're building with, how you're building with folks, I just want to share a few things. So at HEAL, we know that it's an unprecedented collaboration that is necessitated by these conditions, right? Capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, that have separated our people from each other and have used divide and conquer tactics, right? That's part of what's happened throughout history. We know that none of us has all of the answers, that if we actually want to go far, we have to go together, and we have to do it from a place of humility. So one of our protocols is that we are co-creating this, right? So as we enter network together, that we're providing constructive feedback to each other, we're providing our own leadership, and we're helping to co-create a movement that's powerful enough to make change. So often we see that somebody tries something, and instead of helping to make that thing better, we just tear each other down, right? We tear each other down, and we don't need us tearing each other down. There is enough of that. There's enough of that coming at us from corporations. There is enough of that coming at us from the policies that have already been created. There's enough of tearing each other down. We don't need to be part of that. So we're here to bring in our own leadership and co-create together. Another one is that we ensure that communities of color are at the center, right? So we try to hold the context of collective decision-making, make sure that everyone contributes their fair share of labor and resources, and that no matter what degree of privilege that we have, that we try not to be defensive within that, right? So ensuring that if you are from a more privileged community, being willing to listen first, listen to that frontline community first, and act as an ally in support of that, right? And to support the leadership of BIPOC communities within that. We call on each other to embrace new forms of leadership that are about that co-leadership and that co-participation and a contribution by everyone who's impacted by the decisions and processes. So we know that we're not perfect. We know that we have a long ways to go in learning this, but we know that we need everybody's participation. We need everybody's skills and resources in order to make this possible. So it's critical that we all co-participate in that leadership and in that governance together. Another thing is that we recognize the intersectionality of frontline leadership, right? So when we talk about even BIPOC communities, or we talk about queer communities, or we talk about different levels of ability, we know that none of our communities are a monolith, right? Even within any one of the sectors, there are many different experiences that people have, many different priorities, many different needs. And part of what is essential for us to do is really see the humanity in each other, right? There is enough dehumanizing us all the time. And what is critical for our collective liberation is being able to see that humanity in each other. And we know that for so many of us, there's so much historical trauma that we've been a part of, right? That we are reacting to because of that historical trauma. So in order for us to collaborate meaningfully and heal collectively, we know that we're part of each other's healing process. So within that, it means that we watch each other's backs, right? We commit to looking out for one another and recognizing that our collective success as an alliance, as a movement together, that depends on individual success. So we actively work to support and strengthen each other, right? We're not going to speak for each other, especially when we're asked to do so by people who are in power. We're going to support each other having access to information and resources and leadership all the time, because it is essential that we practice that transparency, that trust, and that communication. Our whole principle is rooted in our ability to build trust with each other, right? There's way too many stories about violence that has been done to each other. And it's critical, if we are building strong movement that is truly based in relationship, that is truly creating this new world that we want, that we let go of some of those deeply held beliefs and choose to deliberately cultivate trust so that we can move boldly and move swiftly together to meet this moment and the urgency of it. So I see folks dropping into the chat that you're building with community, you're building with love, you're building with trust, that you're building with other folks, you're ensuring diverse operations are happening. I want to ask you one more question here. So I asked you to think about the role that you are taking. I asked you to think about who you're building with. And I want to ask folks to drop in here. You've been part of this convergence of a few hundred people. The thing we're trying to do, the systems that we're trying to overhaul, the fight that we're in, it's the fight of our lives. And it is beautiful that there has been 600 people at this summit who are actively committed to building with each other. And I know that you are, but that's not going to be enough. So as you go back to your own organizations, your own work, your own community in the virtual world or beyond, who are you going to bring in? Who's somebody that you are going to bring in to build power together so that we can thrive, so that all of our communities can thrive? I want to ask you to drop into the chat. It can be a person, it can be a kind of person, it can be an organization, it can be an institution, but who are you going to bring in? I see Tanya saying stakeholders on campus, so directors, campus farmers, faculty, administration, students, and more. Who else are you going to bring in together to build this movement, a movement that is unstoppable and a movement that can win? I want to bring in and learn more from food chain workers and urban farmers. See, Lori is saying, calling on those with power and resources to serve those who have been marginalized. Who else are you going to bring in to build a powerful movement, an unstoppable movement? Young people and future leaders. This is beautiful. Let's take a couple more minutes for folks to drop in the chat who you're going to bring into this movement. To change everything, it will take everyone. We are literally in the fight for our lives. We know that. We've seen that too closely and too clearly over these last few years. And we know that that is only going to be accelerated over the next few years as climate chaos gets more and more and more intense. And white supremacy and patriarchy are fighting their last gasps to maintain profit and power in this system of capitalism. It's up to all of us to listen to each other, to build with each other, to build something more beautiful, more powerful than any of us thought was possible. And the only way that we can win this fight is by organizing together. I believe in us. And I believe that we can win. I hope that you do too. Thank you for having me here.